All right, today we're talking about how to grow your business with virtual and remote staff. My guest today is Laura Renner. She's from Freedom Makers, and I'll tell you more about her in a second, so stay tuned.
Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we feature top entrepreneurs, business leaders, and thought leaders and ask them how they built key relationships to get where they are today. Now, let's get started with the show.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I am the host of the show. You know, every week I have this great privilege. I get to talk to smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs from all kinds of different companies. We've had Netflix and Grubhub, Redfin, Gusto, Kinko's, YPO, EO. Check out the archives. Lots of great episodes in there. And of course, this episode brought to you by Rise 25, our company where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And of course, our new podcast co-pilot platform. You can learn all about it by going to rise25.com or emailing us at support@rise25.com. All right. And I want to give a quick shout out to Roman Polner, who introduced us to today's guest. Roman is from the Pillar 6 podcast. He's a wealth manager based in the San Francisco Bay Area. He specializes in helping young families to plan for their future. Check out pillar6.com. We're also proud to count him as a client, and he has been a great client we love working with. And my guest, who he introduced us to, is Laura Renner. She's the founder of Freedom Makers Virtual Assistant Services. She's got a really interesting story. She's got a background in the United States Air Force, which is a bit of my background too, because my father and my grandfather were both in the United States Air Force. So we salute her for her service. And she got into helping place military spouses into staffing opportunities in kind of a roundabout way. She got a couple of different degrees and spent a number of years in active duty in the military and eventually got into that. But Laura, I'm excited to have you here and I'm excited to dive into your story. And of course, I always like to ask people who've been in the military what it's like to be, especially when you grew up in that world, what it was like to be an Army or an Air Force brat. You were an Army brat, so your father was in the Army. And usually what comes with that is you move around a lot. I had a little bit of experience with that growing up. My father was out of the Air Force by then, but we moved around a bit. And that really, I feel like, shaped who I am today. So what was that experience like for you? How did it shape who you are today?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me. And it was pretty monumental for us. You know, my dad was enlisted, which so growing up, we went to places like in Europe that we wouldn't have been able to go to. We wouldn't have been able to afford to travel there on vacation. But when you're stationed there, and my mom took advantage, we went all over. At the time, we were only in Western Europe. But to be able to travel as much as you can as a kid, it does impact your sort of outlook on life and your view and understanding how it is possible for people from different cultures to view the same situation differently based on their culture. And so to understand that as a kid was, I think, pretty monumental in informing who I would become as an adult.
Yeah, I never moved internationally. My family always moved domestically, but one of the hard parts is like moving in the middle of a school year or leaving your friends behind. But my understanding, because my dad would always, when we moved, he would talk about what it was like for him when he had to move. And for him, you're usually with a group of other Army or Air Force brats who experience the same thing. So that kind of shaped it a little bit. And oftentimes you're in a base school or a school that's right off of the base. So there's kind of a little bit more of an understanding of what you're going through and a little bit more normal for someone to move in the middle of the school year.
Exactly. Yes. And I got lucky. I only had to move mid-school year once. And, but yeah, it's one of those things where, you know, there are friends from elementary school that I have no idea where they are today. And there's, you know, now I think it's easier with the social media to stay connected.
Definitely. Yeah.
So, you know, there is that piece of it, but it was, especially at, like you said, a base school, it was kind of exciting to see, oh, who's new this year? And I remember learning about things like New Kids on the Block because the New Kids brought that band to us in Germany because we hadn't heard of them prior to that, right? And so that was always exciting. And that whole, you know, oh, I was the new kid in school who got bullied. We didn't really have that experience because, to your point, it was always a large influx of new students, and but they all were from the military, so we did have that in common, especially overseas when every kid is military and not necessarily integrated with the local community kids.
Right. And American, probably. All American.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
For the most part, yeah.
I moved in the middle of fifth grade, and I can still remember it was like a scene out of a movie where like the principal walked me down from the principal's office to my new classroom, and the door opens, and it was like, like a record player screeches to a stop, kind of thing. Every head faces and turns and looks at me. And I was moving from Southern California. I was a Southern California kid moving to suburban Massachusetts, which is very
Oh,
insular.
wow.
Yeah, very
Uh-huh.
insular, very different culturally. And no one wanted to be friends with the new kids. They'd all been in school together for a long time,
Sure.
and I think now, I think that one of the things that I like about entrepreneurship is that you're constantly craving new, or you have to be okay and comfortable with newness. And
Yes.
that's something you have to be okay with when you move around as a kid. Do you think there's anything that prepared you for entrepreneurship from that experience, if you can unpack it?
Absolutely. I think you're spot on. You get comfortable with the unknown when you have that experience as a kid. And so I think definitely that has impacted my approach to entrepreneurship, where even now, as we grow, every year that we grow, it's basically a new milestone for us. It's something we've never experienced before. And rather than being scared by I think my approach has been, well, let me figure out how to do this, and let me reach out to people or apply to programs that will help me understand how to navigate this level of my business. Whereas I don't, I can't say that others don't do that, but I think being comfortable with the unknown because of having moved around a lot as a kid helps me to take that viewpoint or that approach.
Yeah, your mom was a military spouse because your dad was active duty in the army, and she always wanted to start a business, but she never did. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, she worked at AFES, which is the sort of like the general merchandise store on every military base. She worked there, and that let her transfer it for the most part. There would be times where she'd have to wait for an opening or whatnot, but she would talk about that, how she would want to start a business. And others in the community, she was Korean, and so you meet like Korean business owners in the community, and she would talk about maybe one day buying out their business or something, but she never did. But it was always something that was appealing to her. And I think for me, her support of me was always just, even if she couldn't do it, her encouragement of me made me believe I could. And
Yeah.
so that was, I think that planted the seed of her talking about it, even though she never pursued it.
It, it,
Really kind of propelled me forward.
it's crazy to think too, like what you do now wasn't a thing when, one generation ago, like literally like
Right.
one generation later, you have a business that if your business format had been around when your mom was younger, when you were a kid, maybe that would have been something that she could have owned a business in spite of the fact that she was a military spouse who had to move every couple of years.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
amazing that kind of difference. So you kind of like me, I ended up studying English as an undergrad, didn't get to entrepreneurship later. Wish I'd found it at a younger age. You end up going to the United States Air Force Academy and studying there. What was that experience like?
Yeah. My dad, even though he was Army, talked me into going Air Force, and I went there primarily, to be honest, because it was free. I knew that I could do all 4 years without worrying about taking on any student debt or being able to continue going. And it's a really good school, and that ended up working out well for me because it was an engineering school, but I also majored in English, so I got to do a wide variety of things as well as a wide variety of activities that I wouldn't have gotten to do at a civilian school. But I think that also further added to what we were talking about a minute ago around being comfortable with the unknown and being able to push yourself beyond what you think you're capable of, because that very much was a theme at the academy of kind of, I don't want to say stressing you to your limit, but that's kind of the environment where you're under a lot of pressure, and they push you to, at least for me, I learned that there were things where I thought I couldn't do it, and it turned out I could. And oftentimes those were, physical, like how far you could swim or climb a rope or whatnot. But for me, that really impacted my view of being in a stressful environment and knowing I could handle it. And oftentimes being able to handle more than I thought I could. I think has also really impacted my view and my approach to life.
You were at the United States Air Force Academy from 97 to 2001. Were there a lot of women then?
There was about my class had about 13% women. It was 1 in 8.
What was that like being in that, with that percentage?
You know, I think you don't really know anything else,
Mm,
right? And my experience with my one corporate job and in the military is in the military, it's once you're in, you're in. They will take care of you. So a lot of even in situations where I was the only female, it felt like my brothers. I never felt, um, you know, concerned or left out or anything like that. Um, and so that I think is one of those things where you just because it's all I showed up 10 days after I turned 18 years old, so I didn't really know any different,
yeah.
and I always felt supported by everyone I was around.
Yeah, I don't remember the sequence, but some of the military academies were some of the last to really integrate and to have women in them. I don't remember when was if the U.S. Air Force Academy was all male. I imagine it was for a while, and I don't know at what point it allowed women to join.
1980 was the first class for
Okay.
all
Oh, so it'd been a
service
while then.
academies.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. 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 So yeah. And then there was a woman, I think it was in the 90s, who was the first combat Air Force pilot, I want to say.
I
Does that
think
ring a bell?
yes, I can't remember the exact year that they allowed women into fighter aircraft, but it wasn't, I think, until maybe 2016 that women were allowed into all combat roles.
Mm.
Um, but yes, but I want to say it was in the 90s, maybe 94, 95, where there was the first women fighter pilot.
Yeah. Yeah. You were actually active duty after graduating from the Air Force Academy during 9/11.
Yes.
Can you remember back to that time period where you were, what that experience was like?
Yeah, so I stayed for a year. That was about 4 months after I graduated. And I had stayed for a year at the academy and I was teaching English at the academy's prep school or preparatory school. And so we were in Colorado, so it was around 6 a.m., 7 a.m. when the attack started. And so for us, it was more we just went in a total lockdown around security. And and so that kind of shifted our world at the academy for a few months, probably the better part of a year around that. And but that was kind of like the immediate impact was the very tight security that happened within the
Mm.
days because we didn't know what what the attack was, what all it was targeting, right? So I think
Right.
the entire military went into pretty tight
Yeah.
lockdown.
Yeah. I was a speechwriter for the governor at that time of California. And you remember three or four of the planes were bound for California. And there were rumors on that day of that, planes were going to, because one plane was aiming towards the US Capitol. I worked in the state capitol. There were rumors that some were aiming towards the state capitol. There's definitely pandemonium. Um, so you actually you do 6 years in the Air Force and you end up you get a couple more degrees, including eventually getting an IMBA, which is an international MBA from the Chicago Booth School, where you get to entrepreneurship. That seems like a bit of a shift for someone who had been at the military academy, then at the Naval Postgraduate School, and 6 years active duty, and then you go study entrepreneurship. Did the family be like, "What's going on, Laura? Are you going crazy? Like what?" Or was this a evolution?
Yeah, I think I've never asked them. I don't know if they were surprised by it. I think it was one of those things. My brother was also active duty, so we were very much a military family. None of us really knew much about business. So my viewpoint was, I don't know anything about business. I got to go to business school. I feel like my family probably thought the same thing, and none of us just knew any better kind of thing around what the next steps were to launching a business. And so yeah, so I'm not sure. I don't remember anyone being concerned, but rather
Yeah.
being like, okay, that's the next step in your
Well, they
journey.
must have been supportive then, if they didn't.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's
Absolutely.
to an extent, I guess it kind of was breaching or bridging your previous interests because there was the international element to it.
Yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah.
Hmm. And
Um, Go ahead.
Well, at the time, there were not a lot of international focused MBAs in the US. A lot of them, the ones I found at the time, were dual degree, but I already had the first degree, so that also impacted where I applied. And yeah,
You have also spent some time over in China and studied the language. What what do you how does that inform your understanding of the work that you do now, given we, are a much more, cosmopolitan, interconnected world today than we were even 10 or 15 years ago?
yeah, we are, but at the same time, I think especially the US being so geographically separated from the rest of the world, two
Sure
giant
is, right?
oceans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
we do have that ability to still be a bit insular, and which, has its pros and cons, right? And so, but I think for me, what learning another language, especially a language as different from English as Chinese is, it really taught me the value of communication. And, you don't, just because you're missing a comma doesn't mean the other person doesn't understand what you're trying to say, right? So if you focus on what are you trying to actually communicate, you can really come to a lot of understanding with whoever you're communicating with. And so that, I think that has really freed me, to be honest, around how I engage with people and appreciate their insights or how they see things, and recognizing that it might be different from how I view things, because I've been in other parts of the world where it's natural for them to view things differently from me, and that's okay.
Right, right. You also such a diverse round of different backgrounds. I feel like I'm jumping around here, but it's your life. Um,
Right, right.
BuBuBooks was an online bookstore that you started in the midst of all this,
Hmm.
selling bilingual storybooks. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think I want to say that idea actually came about during my first when I was learning Mandarin, because sometimes you want to be able to read your new language, but um, it's so complicated you can't really just read it by itself. So I was like, oh, it'd be nice if the English were next to it. And then you kind of think, well, a children's book would be easier to understand, so it'd be
Yeah, I got
nice to have
pictures.
that.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's 2 lines a page, right? And
Hmm.
it was so hard to find. Meanwhile, recognizing that we are a nation of immigrants, we do have a lot of children who are multilingual. What, that it would serve kind of two purposes. So that would led me to start that company. I started it in '08 as an e-commerce business, which e-commerce didn't really exist back then. Like, I remember people, PayPal, I think it was just had just come out, but it was back when people said, "Oh, I don't trust any company that wants me to pay via PayPal," right? And now it's sort of
Yeah.
standard. So it was a little before its time in that regard,
And
as
you're
far as e-commerce.
pre-Shopify, like probably putting together the
Exactly.
website was challenging. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I also just didn't understand basic business fundamentals. Like, I built the website, and then my joke is I built the website and then I took a nap. Like, I wasn't really doing a lot of outreach or hustling, if you will, to get traction with it. And so, and that was leading into the recession. And so I think it never got off the ground, but it was still an interesting experience that um, informed me about how I would approach things at my follow-on businesses.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Freedom Makers and how you got into that. I think it was a former commander of yours had retired from the Air Force and wanted you to work for him. So that led you into helping him at his company, doing recruiting there. And you found that they didn't have a very good recruiting system in place. And so that kind of led you into the recruiting world. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it was about 1,000 person company, and they didn't have, in the parlance, they didn't have an ATS, an applicant tracking system, or really anything
That's
around.
crazy to me that a company of that size didn't have anything like that.
Right. And it was a government contractor. So there was a lot of EEO compliance you had to follow. And it was all being done through Excel
Wow.
and manual tracking everything. And so that helped me to really kind of hone how I view and how I build systems and processes, more like processes rather than systems, and workflows. And so that really kind of informed me that, oh, I like this part. I'm good at this around building workflows and processes. And so that when I left that company, I tried to start a business doing that for other similar sized companies. But my first client was like, that's great. Can you just hire someone for me? And so we became a recruiting company. And it turned out that I didn't actually enjoy that piece of it. I liked building the workflows. I didn't enjoy the actual recruiting. So that
That's
one
a
also
tough
never,
job. Like you really need like a personality for that because you're like constantly chasing down people, trying to convince them to either, let you place someone, or you're trying to chase down other people saying, "Oh, you might be happy with your job here, but I got a better job for you." That's a tough job.
yeah. And I think too, for me, recognizing that my strength is in strategy, um, doing the actual fulfillment was not my strength, or it wasn't. I didn't have the confidence for it, right? Like I'd rather build and run the business than deliver the fulfillment of the service, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I realized too that was my own personal weakness, that uh, being the primary deliverer of the service was not something that I
Yeah.
am strong at
So where did
or have the confidence in.
the aha come between, helping companies with fundamentally labor shortage, staffing, and then also military spouses? Where did that come from?
Yeah, so during that time I was meeting a lot of, I call them solopreneurs, the solo practitioners who just weren't ready to hire. Whether it's because they didn't have enough work for even a part-time person, or they didn't have the consistent revenue to feel like they could commit to hiring even part-time help. And so I saw that they had this need. They just weren't, there wasn't really anyone to support them in that need. Meanwhile, my brother is still full-time Air Force. He was getting ready to move again. I was having that conversation with my sister-in-law about what she was going to do for work. And then just like, man, this is not the first time I've had this conversation with her. And it just reminded me, like, even my mom, she had to start over even though she worked at AFES, she would have to pretty much start over every time we moved. And, colleagues, when they would come into the office, be like, oh, what does your spouse do? Because, they're always having to start over. So that made me realize there's this untapped source of talent on the military spouse side and this unmet need on the solopreneur side. And that's what kind of was that aha for me around, we could give this flexible work that they can take with them wherever they go, and still meet the needs of a solopreneur who doesn't need, our average client uses us 5 hours a week. Like it's super part-time work, and there wasn't really a lot out there for them to get that type of support. And so
Yeah.
that's what led me to put the two together.
Now you talk about similar to the BuBuBooks situation where you didn't have Shopify, PayPal was barely in operation. You started this company 11 years ago now, and around then there weren't as many solutions. There weren't as many, staffing, related software and thing like that. So how did you put the systems in place, or did you kind of cobble it together to start?
Yeah, definitely cobbled together with I like to call Zapier the duct tape for small business, where you just kind of piece
Yep.
things together. But yeah, there were some things out. You know, Google Workspace was pretty big back then, and in fact, that's how we did our time tracking, was on a shared Google sheet, between the freedom maker and the client. And then we relied a lot on forms, and so we would send a form to a client, to purchase hours, and we would um, ask freedom makers to fill out forms to let us know that they were interested in a certain opportunity. But it was all through a lot through email and forms and Google Sheets, a lot of manual work behind the scenes to make it look as automated as possible, or and supportive as possible to both the clients and the freedom makers.
Yeah. I think of my grandmother who, my dad's mom, who passed away when I was pretty young. And she never really had a career. She was an artist. She actually was a model for a while. But she followed my grandfather around from assignment to assignment. And even my grandfather wasn't there for my father's birth because my father was born in Brooklyn. He was in it was right before World War II, and he was in Texas at training, pilot school. And I think about the impact that this could have had for someone like her who didn't have that opportunity to have a career, put money on put food on the table for the family. What has this impact been like for, you call them your freedom makers, for the military spouses that you've been able to place into positions?
Yeah, so I think nowadays some of the modern challenges, well, I guess they existed back then as well. Oftentimes the service member is deploying for short deployments for undisclosed amount of time and kind of no notice. So you end up having to run your house and your family without a kind of a reliable partner. And it's no fault of theirs, right? They have to,
Yeah.
they're serving their mission. And so um, but to do that while also maintaining a full-time job that may or may not move with you, that I think that's a hard part to balance. And so for us at least, where we have really focused is on the flexibility side of things. So we don't have minimum hours that they have to work, so they can balance, like if they have young kids or if they whatever is going on in their life, they can balance how much work they're able to contribute versus also not versus, but also running their house and their family. And also, as you probably saw with your grandmother and your mom, they have so many diverse skills and talents because they've moved so much and they've, have to adapt. And that's one of the things I
Sure.
always say too. Like the military trains a service member on how to do their job, right? There's no training for spouses
Mm,
on how to manage multiple moves to new communities where you don't know anyone, to um, run your family or support your family without your other nearby family to help you, that kind of thing.
right.
Like you have to figure all that out on your own. There's no training for that. So they always develop these great skills. I always say, like, regardless of work experience, education, or skills, every military spouse I've met knows how to do three things for sure. One is research, the other is be organized, and the other is be adaptable. And that's what business owners need. That's exactly what they need. So they get to bring a lot of versatility and skills, like a renaissance of skills to their clients, and they don't have to sort of pigeonhole themselves into doing one type of career or one type of job. So I think that's where we have had that impact on the spouse community is they get that flexibility in not just commitment, but also in the skills they get to use for that side of their brain.
And you mentioned that some of the early clients, at least, were like solopreneurs who hadn't hired before. Was that a challenge for you then to place like, staff into these companies that hadn't had staff before, didn't know how to supervise them or train them or things like that? Did you have to get involved in those sorts of things?
A little bit. I think what we've shifted toward over the years is more like clarifying the expectations around, especially someone who's virtual and the kind of support they can give, and also going back to that, freedom is our guiding principle. So if a solopreneur is too busy to engage their freedom maker, then that usually leads to sort of fizzling out of we call it an assignment. So it's more like we kind of screen for that and really sort of, I don't want to say educate, but encourage clients to be ready to consistently engage their freedom maker and to have things in place and to delegate. And so it's more like I don't we haven't really stepped in, but more like sort of screening for and then educating and encouraging clients to be ready for that when they choose their freedom maker.
Yeah, of course. Now in 2020, a big thing happened. We all remember. There was this COVID thing that happened. I've interviewed so many people since then, and many kind of followed this path of absolute shock and terror and like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Everything I built is going to come crashing down. And then in many cases, then it went the opposite direction, which, what was it like for you with a virtual staffing business? Did you experience that as well?
Yes. So I remember I would tell my team, we're going to come out of this stronger than ever. And then I'd shut down Zoom and I'd crawl into bed and cover
Oh,
my head up.
jeez. Oh, God.
But yeah, for us, I remember I would go to networking events, and I was living in Oakland at the time, and if I went out to like suburbs, and I would say, oh yeah, I have a virtual assistant agency, they would even the Bay Area, a pretty large area, the suburbs people would be like, what's a virtual assistant? Like they had never heard of it before. So
Mm,
COVID sort of helped us as far as people understanding what a virtual assistant is and that they could get that support and also that they could run their business remotely. So be more open to hiring someone like us. Meanwhile, it also helped me to realize, because they always say, like, you have to diversify your revenue, you have to diversify your revenue. And so I always thought I needed to get corporate clients or government clients because we were focused on solopreneurs. But what COVID helped me realize is that while we focus on solopreneurs, small teams, like kind of up to 10 employees, we have such a diverse industry across that was our diversification. So while some of our clients, because the fear for me when that happened was, if our clients shut down, we're going to shut down, right? And so, because the military had to keep working, I knew the spouses were going to be there. It was more what was going to happen to our clients, and they found a way to be resilient. And yes, some of our clients were required to shut down, but even them, they found a way to make something work out during that time.
Most did, so, right? I mean, except for,
exactly,
there were very few businesses that completely shut down. If they did, it was maybe a very short window of time.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So that one built my confidence that even, for the past few years now, we keep waiting for this recession to happen, right? And even if it does, I'm like, our clients are resilient. Small business owners, they have to be, right? That it's their bread and butter. It's how they make a living. So they're going to find a way to make it work. And we're going to help them with that. And as a result, we're going to work. And so that was really eye-opening for me to realize, one, just how resilient small business owners are in the US, as well as personally understanding how diversified our client base was. And so that was good for us as a company as well.
Yeah. And it's funny how diversification happens sometimes and you don't even realize the diversification. I interviewed one guy who had a line of sandwich shops in the New York City area. And before COVID, he'd opened 2 shops in the suburbs and all the rest were in the financial district. And before COVID, the financial district ones were doing gangbusters, making all his money, right? And the suburbs were like hardly anything. And then COVID flipped that. And if he didn't have the suburban ones, which were doing so poorly before, he would have lost the entire business because the financial ones were all closed because no one was going to work. And so it was a diversification, but he didn't even realize it. And it was not something that he would have asked for because he, going into COVID beforehand, he resented the suburban locations. He was like, I need to close these, and they ended up doing so well. So it's funny how we don't even realize what the diversification might be.
Right. Yeah. But also, if COVID hadn't happened, would those businesses would they have supported his growth, right? Or would they have dragged him down? So it's like, you don't know when you need that diversification either.
Right. So we're getting a little short on time here, but for those who are listening to this who haven't started diversifying their hiring strategy, why would they, what's the benefits? What are the pros? You've touched on them already, but why should they consider military spouses for helping support and grow their business?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I think when it comes to military spouses, there's a higher starting line of trust than with a complete stranger. So there's that piece, just from the nature of the type of work, the type of life they live. There's a higher foundation of trust. And I think for us specifically, our flexibility around, we don't have minimum hours. So there's that flexibility around commitment is attractive to people. And then going back to the freedom makers themselves too, they are all American citizens or becoming American citizens. Not that the citizenship part matters, but the fact that they know American culture, American business nuances. I think sometimes business owners prefer that. Either they have to for security, their compliance security, depending on what they do, or they just prefer that because then there's less lost in translation when you're asking them to do something for you because they understand what you're trying to ask them to do just through the American language and business nuances that people have, right? So I think that those two things specifically around trust and just the cultural awareness of working, if you need that in your company, those are two reasons to choose a military spouse.
Yeah. And flexibility and time zone is another big one as well. They're working in your time zone most of the time, I imagine, unless they're stationed somewhere abroad.
Oh, right. Yeah. So what we ask is if instead of them saying they need to be in your time zone, we ask, if they're available to work in that time zone, if that's what the client needs. Sometimes the work is asynchronous, so it doesn't matter. And sometimes our clients have team members overseas, so they want someone with differing availability based on who they're supporting and how they're supporting them.
Right, right. Well, great learning about your company, Laura, and you. I want to wrap up with my gratitude question. So I'm a big fan of expressing gratitude and giving my guests the opportunity to express gratitude to those, especially peers and contemporaries who have helped them in their journey. Who would you want to shout out and thank?
Yeah, so I'll do a shout out to that former commander. His name is Daryl Sims. In fact, he now lives in the outskirts of Dallas, and I was just visiting him a couple months ago. We were still close. He was probably my first mentor when I was on active duty, even though he was my boss's boss. But he, again, going back to how we talked about being pushed or asked to do things you didn't think you could do, he did that for me, while also guiding me, in a mentorship way. And then when he retired, he, called me up and said, well, you can work for me at this company. And it was one of those things where you just don't say no. So, but that worked because that's what led me down this path that I'm at now, with Freedom Makers. So very grateful for him and his family and the support they have provided me and my family over the years. It's been now over 20 years that we've known each other.
Wow. Wow. And so cool how you have been able to marry these two different kind of disparate interests in entrepreneurship and then, love of military service. So appreciate you for your service and appreciate you for helping support so many military spouses. Where can people go to learn more about you and about Freedom Makers?
Yeah, so our website is www.freedom-makers.com. And there's a lot of stuff on our site there. People can schedule calls. And then I'm on LinkedIn, Laura Yang Renner. People can find me there too.
All right, Laura, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.